Welcome to Break Free from Corporate, the only podcast dedicated to bringing you business success secrets from leading entrepreneurs with one thing in common. They left the corporate world, became their own boss, and are now living incredible lives. To access previous and all future episodes, visit breakfreefromcorporate.com and subscribe today.
Well, welcome everyone. This is Gavin Sequeira here, and I'm very pleased to bring you an exciting guest on our show today. His name is Daniel Phillips. He's actually a good friend of mine. Now, I've known Daniel for a few years, and he is a little bit different to some of the other guests that we've had in the past. Daniel is the owner and the founder of Sydney History Tours. People who are into their history and want to know, how things started back in the day and all of that, Daniel's the guy to go to, especially if you live in Sydney. And he's also started the Virtual History Australia business, and he's also the founder of Sydney Ghost Tours. So people who like ghosts and all that ghouly stuff, Daniel's your guy. Now, what I'm excited about today is to really talk about Daniel's journey from where he started and what he was doing prior to running his business and how he got into this line of work and what he's doing and all the stuff that, I'm sure you'll find really fascinating. So, Daniel, if you're there, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Excellent. So, I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. I've actually meant to do this a long time ago, and I'm really glad that we've made the time now. So, Daniel, firstly, what you do is very, very different to a lot of the other guests I talk to. It's an interesting line of work that you're in.
Yeah, well, essentially, I run history tours during the day for the Australian Compulsory History Syllabus for Year 7 through to Year 12 during the day. Now, this later prompted me creating Sydney Ghosts Tours so that I could tell adults the stories I'm not allowed to tell kids during the day. And the thing is that a lot of academic history is kind of dry cleaned. The thing is that as you look into it, a lot of the time, it's one person who wasn't there passing an opinion from someone else who also wasn't there. And if you were to get into a time machine and go back and try to talk to the original person, say, so when you were doing this, is this what you were thinking? And they'd probably look at you blankly and go, you what? Because the thing is a lot of the time with academic history, it's someone in the 20th or the 21st century taking the assumptions of that time and going back to the 18th or the 19th century, when, of course, these things were not, in fact, the case. So in order to make walking through a cemetery real for a 13 or 14-year-old kid, I've got to explain what life was actually like at the time, so that when I talk about and when they did this, it actually makes sense, because without context, things don't actually have a meaning. Now, ironically, I found that particularly with the history tours that I was doing for schools, I was restricted in numbers that could actually come, because the kids had to be able to leave their school, come on my tour and get home within that same day, which meant their travelling time had to be maybe an hour to an hour and a half tops. And that meant that really about as far as they could travel might have been from, say, Wollongong or Newcastle to Sydney, or from the Blue Mountains to Sydney, and that was about it. And that limited my numbers of who I could reach quite substantially. And the thing is, a lot of the time, particularly during the history tours and also more particularly on the ghost tours, for everything that I was walking past in a cemetery, there might be 15 good stories that I could be telling, but I couldn't, because I just didn't have the time. So what I decided to do was, well, this is kind of crazy. And I created Virtual History Australia as a result of it. Now, in the initial stages, this was so that I could reach schools that physically couldn't come on my tours.
Fantastic.
And the thing is that going down this particular path of taking what I do in person and putting it online opened a whole new can of worms, because I literally had to learn how to become a documentary filmmaker, a film presenter. How do you go and use the various technologies? How do you do lighting? How do you actually not look like a complete freak but when you're actually trying to film yourself in the middle of a cemetery at night, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, it was a huge learning curve. And the thing is that I had to unlearn some of the things that I did initially, because when you go into small business, there's a tendency to try to do absolutely everything yourself, even if you actually suck at that particular thing.
Tell me about it.
And the thing is that being able to, first of all, know enough about what you're doing to be able to communicate to someone else what it is you want, and then be able to get them to get the result you want. That became a whole learning experience by itself. But I'm probably getting myself a little bit further down the track.
No, that's okay. We'll definitely get into all of these topics in a bit more detail. But I find it fascinating, Daniel, because for you to really go down this track in the depth that you have and expand the circles of people that you can reach, so children, adults, virtual, all of this, you must really love your history and want to make sure that it's told, in an unbiased way, or at least have the facts out there. So have you always been someone that loved history right from the beginning, or was there a point where you just noticed that there were aspects missing and you wanted to kind of correct the fill in the gaps? I mean, what led you to this path?
The thing is if you go to the very etymology of the word history, it's his story.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that the stories that we have really are the things that are part literally of our identity. Now, if we define ourselves as an Australian, there's a whole, what does being an Australian mean? Well, then there's a whole string of stories that are attached to that. And the thing is that they resonate with us really, really closely. And people a lot of the time aren't aware of it. But ironically, I wasn't a professional historian. In fact, I worked in the IT industry, and I would walk from where I was at home and I would go through a particular cemetery on my way through to where my work was. And the thing is that I recognized the names on the graves I was walking past as being suburbs, towns, streets, etc. But I noticed that the graves themselves weren't being particularly well looked after, and I thought, this is really weird. If this is like a really famous person who did something amazing, why isn't someone, cleaning this grave or whatever? Yeah. And I started asking more and more questions. And the very process of asking the questions really took me down the rabbit hole.
Wow.
The thing was that I learned that because I was coming into this from a kind of man from Mars perspective, I hadn't been indoctrinated into one particular point of view. But I learned very, very quickly that the more that I read, that there was a kind of groupthink that went into certain aspects of history that wasn't really supported when you went back to the original documentation. So when someone like an original Burke or Wills is actually writing in his diary versus someone 150 years later, they're not worried about, someone in the 19th century is not obsessed with identity politics, for example.
No.
In fact, their terms for it are probably pretty crude by 21st century standards. So, yeah.
Wow.
So from that point of view, what happened was that I originally was obsessed with thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if these gravestones could talk? And the idea wouldn't go away. So I kept ruminating in this over and over in my head. And I sat down with my father, who was an electrical engineer, and we came up with an idea to have an electronic device that was solar powered, that sat in front of a gravestone that had either a proximity sensor or a pressure pad. So when you stood in front of the grave, it started telling you the story of the person like a radio play.
That's a great idea.
Now, the thing is that it's cost me a lot of money, a lot of time, and we started producing these things with the idea of putting them in front of every tourism type monument.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that we trialled a number of these things in places like Rookwood Cemetery, where we learned, first of all, we needed to put timers on these things because we didn't realise there were 8 caretakers' residences actually within the boundary of Rookwood Cemetery. Now, Rookwood Cemetery, for people who haven't been there, is the largest cemetery in the Southern Hemisphere. It's about
Wow.
389 acres or think in size, or something like about a couple of hundred hectares.
Wow.
And it's something that pilots can see from like about 30,000 feet and use it as a navigation reference.
That's incredible.
Now, the thing is that I placed one of these devices next to the Tui's family grave in Rookwood. Now, Tui's is a major beer making company of like 100 plus years. So I was telling the story of how the Tui's brothers got put together their beer making empire. But what I didn't realise was that by not putting a timer on it and having an elderly gentleman who lived in the caretakers' residences, it's like about 8:45 at night during the summer. It's just gotten dark, and this guy's walking past a grave that starts talking to him. And the poor bastard literally has a mild heart attack and has to be taken to hospital as a result of it. However, later on, we placed one of these devices outside of a little country town called Trundle in central western New South Wales. Now, I was very, very lucky that the local historical society had some letters from one of the families that went backwards and forwards between mother to son with one of the graves, this particular memorial. And the thing is, I thought the best way of telling the stories of this Anzac monument was to have voiceover actors actually read the letters in sequence to tell the story of what happened. So it started from the boys who wrote to mum to say that they've just joined up, and then they literally marched all the way from Parkes down to Sydney as part of the recruiting drive to get people to go off to war. They were writing back to mum talking about their training experiences down in Sydney, getting on the boat at Woolloomooloo, being taken to Egypt and doing more training there, and then hitting the beaches in Gallipoli. Now, the thing is, as it turned out of the 5 brothers, 4 of them died actually on the Gallipoli campaign. Sorry, actually, 3 of the brothers died on the Gallipoli campaign. 2 of them made it to the Western Front, and the other 2 died on the Western Front at different times. And the last one died only about a couple of months before the end of World War I. So as a result, all 5 of these brothers are on this particular monument. And the thing is, it's not actually in town. It's on the corner of a couple of different properties. Now, the thing is that it was a story that absolutely moved me, but because of where it was, we're talking about a place that's got a higher local population of kangaroos and emus than it does humans. So I wasn't expecting anybody really to actually hear or see this thing very much. Now, what happened was that a local school teacher's car broke down a couple of 100 metres down the road, and because Trundle's not an area that's known for its mobile phone reception, this guy is walking to try to get to a farmhouse in order to get help, and he walks past this thing and it activates. Anyway, and he stands in front of this thing listening to it for like about 35, 40 minutes. And he's just gobsmacked. And he then goes because he's a primary school teacher, he convinces the principal of the school to allow him to go and take the kids to watch and to listen to this thing. So you get a group of like about 7, 8, 9-year-olds in front of this thing, and they realise that the story that they're hearing isn't a fairy story, it's real, and the person that died, their name is on the piece of stone in front of them.
It's incredible.
And so like a bunch of these kids are literally in tears and go home. And mum and dad, very indignant the next day, why is my child in tears, blah, 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 what are you bastards doing to my kids, etc. And a number of them then go down to visit this thing themselves, because most of the town didn't even know this thing existed anymore. And a couple of these people ended up writing to the to the Australian War Memorial down in Canberra, saying what a fabulous thing it was that they'd placed this thing there to tell the story about their locals and how proud they are of these people that they've forgotten that they didn't even know existed. And So as you can imagine,
Yeah.
this causes a bit of a kerfuffle down in Canberra, who
Yeah.
duly send someone to drive all the way from Canberra up into central western New South Wales, which is something like about a 5 or 6 hour driving
Yeah.
trip.
Yeah.
Go and take a look at this thing. And we have a little plaque on the side of the device with a telephone number with my father's business, Electronics and Regulating Engineering, on the side of it.
Yeah.
And he gets a telephone call from Canberra saying, who are you? Did anybody give you permission to be able to do this?
Yeah.
And the thing was, ironically, the War Memorial and the government had nothing to do with it. The
Right.
people who actually built these things most of the time weren't the government. They were usually paid for by the families who'd lost a loved one, because the body never came back from
Yeah.
places like the Western Front or Gallipoli. The very word cenotaph is like a Greek word. It comes from kino, which means empty, and taphos, which means tomb. So what was happening was that the various families, knowing that their son or daughter was never coming back, wanted a place to be able to go grieve.
Yeah.
So when you
Makes
look
sense.
at one of these things in a park or like in the middle of a town square, you are literally looking at a place where the families went to grieve for a son or daughter who never came home.
You know, doing that simple act of sharing that story and using, you know, whatever means you and your father had at the time to kind of just put that out there, in a way kind of attracted, you know, maybe the wrong attention, but then it's led, you know, a lot of this stuff to formulate. And really, I guess this is the backbone of your story, really, and how things started to.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. The point that I'm about to make here is that success isn't built on success, because ultimately these devices never actually took off. They cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it didn't happen. Success is usually built on the ashes of failure.
No,
And the thing was that, and as a result, what happened was that all of the intellectual property that was generated by this entire effort, which was being supported by my working somewhere else at the time, it all came to a head when the company that I was working for at the time was bought out by an overseas conglomerate who decided that they wanted to change all of the products that we supplied from being name brand products to no name products, and we had to then go back to our corporate customers and lie to them to say these things are as good as the stuff we used to sell. The only problem was they weren't, and they didn't work with our customers' software. So when they got up and they made this announcement, everybody in the meeting room was dead quiet, and I was the only person at the back of the room, and I got up and said, "Can I ask a question, please?" And they say, "Sure." I said, "Okay. So when our clients find out that this new hardware doesn't work with their software, what do we do at that point?" And the thing is that the entire the management team and the new owners, their faces just went completely blank, and they said, "Oh, but it does." I said, "Sorry, but I've actually got a thing here from Australian Personal Computer where independent tests and choice say absolutely that it doesn't, and that it's a piece of crap, and that they wouldn't use this thing to go on as a doorstop in front of their office."
Wow.
And based on this, all of the people that we're selling to, the reason they buy things from us is we tell them the truth. The moment we start lying to them, they're going to stop buying from us.
100%. Yeah.
And the thing was that this literally caused the meeting to end in an uproar. And about 35, 40 minutes later, I'm called up to a boardroom where I'm berated for making the new owners lose face.
Wow.
And I said, "Look," and I was told, "You're going to tell your clients this thing is fabulous, and you're going to sell it, and you're going to tell everybody else it is." And I said, "Of course I'm not. The reason that you hired me to start with was I had a prior relationship to these people, and that relationship is based on telling them the truth. The moment that I tell them a lie, they're going to stop buying from me. You're going to fire me anyway, and I'm never going to be able to talk to those people again. So who do you think I'm really working for here? You or the client?" And as you can imagine, about 15, 20 minutes later, I was cashiered and out the door.
Oh, yes.
Now, the thing is that this leaves me in a point where all of my income has now vanished.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get a glowing reference from these people from having had the temerity to tell the truth.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm now in a position where I have to go and take all of this information that I've created from years of research, from going down rabbit holes, and think, okay, how can I use this information in a way that adds value to people? And as it turns out, up here in Sydney, there's most of the locations that used to be around for history, for school excursions, are gone. Places like Old Sydney Town that used to be around Summersby up near Gosford were closed years ago. And there's still a requirement for the Australian Compulsory History syllabus for them to do what are called site visits, what used to be called school excursions. So what I did is I thought, okay, well, there's all these amazing stories that tell the snippets of what life was really like as part of the history syllabus. If I can tell a lot of these stories from closer to the first person rather than a dry recitation of the facts, would people want to listen to it? And that was how Sydney History Tours started. And the thing was, again, I had no money. It was, let me put it this way, it wasn't no money, but let's just say I wasn't as flush as I would have liked to be.
Oh, well, this was the early days, absolutely. This is really a passion-driven project, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, if you're not passionate about something, you won't go through the pain, the inconvenience, the frustration, all of the stuff you invariably go through that are the teething pains associated with a new venture.
Yes.
Because the thing is that you need to be able to go past the fact that when you first start using something like Xero or MYOB or something like that, A, you're probably going to hate it. B, you're initially going to have to suck at it.
Yep.
But you're still going to have to push through to get good at it, or at least good enough to get to a point where it's handled.
Yes.
And the thing is that there's going to be initially you're going to be wearing a lot of different hats, and not all of them are going to fit.
Good point.
Or at least not going to fit naturally.
Good point.
So you're going to have to actually be prepared to embrace the suck, if you will, long enough to be able to get...
But I know what you're saying. Yeah.
To be able to get past that, to get to a point where you're competent enough that you can have other people do it and have it at least 80 to 90% of where you are, or at least well enough to be able to get by, so that you don't have to be the person that fronts up and does it all of the time.
Yes.
Because the idea is that you're trying to go past being the Lone Ranger, and even Lone Ranger had Tonto and a support system. Okay?
He did.
You've got to go past that to, if you really want it to, first of all, you have to first be playing a team sport, and then you have to get it to a point where the team's going so well that you're just now the team manager or owner, and you can cheer from the sidelines and go have a holiday occasionally without the business owning you rather than the other way around.
That's a great analogy. Really, really well put. Well, that's what we encourage people. I mean, I talk to people every day, Daniel, as you know, around this topic, and most people are good at what they do, but they're so good that they get stuck in that they believe they have to do everything themselves. No one can do it better than me attitude. And you know, I like the fact that you said pretty much from day one almost, you've got to start thinking team and building good people and resources around you, and maybe get to the point where you can step out every now and again, if not altogether.
Now, I must admit, I'm not quite at that point yet. I'm still in the process of working towards that goal. But the thing is that it's a case of you're going to suck at certain things anyway. And you'll have to be able to be prepared to push past that. And then eventually, at the moment, just at this stage, I have something like about 14, 15 different people that I rely on for specific services and various other things to do what I do. And I'm still predominantly a home-based business.
Yes.
Now, the thing is that I want to get to a point where that's ideally no longer the case anymore. So that I can walk away from the business and not have it fall in a complete heap while I'm not there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And that's one of the great challenges about being in business, which is you constantly are working on this thing. You get it to a certain point and then you realize, oh, I can go further. I can do this. I can do that. And you can systemize more. You can automate more. You can outsource things more. You can bring in good people. Yeah, I think it's great that you're on that path and you're making things happen. And you've been doing this now for a number of years and you've been doing
yeah.
it really well. And I noticed that you've also, over the course of time, you've been featured in the media and you've done a lot of articles
Yeah.
and been on radio and TV and all that sort of stuff. So you're definitely getting the word out there.
Yeah. Well, the thing is again, that was also to some degree a reaction to the situation that I was in when I first started, because I wasn't flush with capital. I wasn't in a position where I could talk to my local newspaper and say, okay, here's $15,000 for a front page ad.
Yeah.
So what I had to do is it's what the process of becoming self-employed does is that if you genuinely want to have something wonderful at the end of it, is that who do I have to become and what do I have to do to make it happen, even if I don't have the resources? Who else does, and how do I have it so that they want to help me along the way?
Yes.
And part of that process was the process of PR or public relations is basically about helping a journalist to write a good story that's going to make them look good.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is that I had great stories. How do I help a journalist fulfill something for them that's going to then help me?
Yes.
Now, the thing is that this is a process that particularly Sue Papadoulis who is a business coach from Western Australia, focused on. Now, she predominantly now does the entire PR process for businesses, but she had a course called Publicity for Profit.
Yes, I heard of that one. Yep.
Now, for me, I heard about that particular course, and again, I didn't have the money to do it. I desperately wanted to do it, so I had to work out a way of actually getting myself on the course. So what happened was that I kept trying and I kept trying and I kept trying, and an opportunity came up where Sue was actually in Sydney, and a couple of people actually at the last minute had to pull out. And Sue rang me up and said, well, we've got a place for you. We know you've been wanting to get on this thing. If we were to put a payment program together, would you be there? And I said, so where are you right now? And they said, well, we're in this hotel. I said, I'll be there in 15 minutes. Now, the thing was that because I was prepared because it was something I'd set the goal, I absolutely want to do it. And I was determined. Not a lot of people sort of look at things and they say, well, I can't afford that.
Yes.
And that's when their brain switches off.
Yes.
They just give up. Now, the thing is that it's a really spectacularly not helpful way of getting
it's not helpful at all. No.
Yeah. So from the point of view, you then have to say, okay, how can I make this happen?
Yes.
What do I need? What resources? How can I find a way to achieve this goal? And it involves being able to think outside of the box. And I suppose this is the process that is really, really different from often working in a job as distinct from working inside your own business, is that it forces you to have to be incredibly resourceful. Yes. And if I don't have the resource, how do I find it? How can I acquire it? How can I find a way that I can provide? If someone else has that resource, how do I create a win-win for them so that I can have that resource?
Yeah.
And in this particular case, for Sue Papadoulis, she had someone that was more committed than a kamikaze to actually applying this information. Yeah. So unlike some people who will turn up and they will buy a course and it literally becomes shelf help.
Yes.
You know, because they listen to it, they watch it, they read it, but they put it on a shelf and nothing ever happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what happened was that literally whilst we are in the course, and we're being taught how to write a press release, I'm listening and I'm trying to find every creative idea to use what Sue was telling me. And as it turned out, we wrote a press release in the course. Sue took a look at it, said, that looks great. I sent it out literally whilst I'm in the classroom by email using my phone.
Yeah.
And I had a telephone call from 3 newspapers within a couple of hours. We're still in the course. They wanted to run it.
That's fantastic.
Now, as it turned out, a couple of months after that, coming up to Halloween, I was featured on the Channel 10 breakfast program, where they called me in. I was decided, okay, well, if I'm going to look like a loon, go for it. So I ended up wearing the full, the top hat, the bow tie, the full black cape, the whole 9 yards. And I said, okay, well, the reason I'm dressed up like this is that this is something that happened 18th, 19th century. So I thought, I'll just go with it.
Yeah.
And they thought it was fabulous because it gave them a good visual in terms of going through. The people who were on the actual panel had fun. We laughed.
Yeah.
And that was ultimately, it was a case of thinking through what was the television program looking for?
Yes.
What reaction were they trying to get, and helping them to get it?
Yes.
And this is the point. You win by helping other people win.
Yeah, it's a really great point. It's a really great point. No, it's fantastic, Daniel. Well, I mean, one of the lessons we can take out of that is, always look to help someone else get to their goal. And if you can do that in the process, you can find ways that can help you. And sometimes you'll find, and some of my great mentors have taught me, if you can put value out there first, or look at a way to give first, you will always receive later. And there's a lot of other people who will tell you, you need to ask for the sale, you need to be closing, you need to be always trying to get what you can at every moment. I find that doesn't work these days. People are too aware that you're out there trying to sell things, and they can smell that 100 yards away. Whereas when you come from a genuine space like you do, which is, yep, I need this, but how can I find a win-win sort of approach? I think that's really a great way to go about things, not just business, but life in general. But I think I can see how you would have, overcome a lot of major hurdles because you approached it from this perspective.
Well, the thing is that a lot of people tend to do things reverse. They will ask for things without having provided something first.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you're always willing to help people that you like and that you trust, and who you believe there's going to be a reasonable reciprocity involved. Whereas a lot of people ask for help, but they haven't actually built rapport. They haven't actually thought through, okay, this is what this particular person needs. How can I provide what they need and have them want to give me what I need?
Yeah.
And the operative word is for them to want to give you something.
Yeah, so, it is. Well, it's also being really creative. You're very much solution oriented. You're thinking 10 steps ahead on how to get to the end goal, but in the process, rather than burning bridges and stepping on people's toes and all of that stuff, you're really building rapport. You're building bridges. You're forming great connections. And sometimes you help someone in one little thing here, might not yield a result today, but you never know down the track, because you took the time to build that rapport and help that person. When the time comes for you to ask for that favor, or your name comes across their desk, they go, "Oh, Daniel, that guy, I remember him. He's a great guy."
Exactly. And
so,
nowhere is that, in fact, more important than in places like dealing with the press.
Yes.
Because the thing is that it's a relatively small pond. Most people know each other. If you've been rude to one person, 4 or 5 other people will hear about it.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you will have people who will frequently move from one news organisation to another.
Yeah.
And most of the time it will have been a promotion.
Yeah.
So the thing is that I've had reporters who worked for one small place that moved to a bigger one. And then when Halloween came around, so like, hi, Daniel, I now work for such and such, and we'd like to go and talk about this. Can you help? And the thing is that because they've gotten used to me providing a stream of creative ideas that 6 or 7, 8 times out of 10 they might not use, but the very fact that you're there once a month, once every couple of months, was something like, yeah, that's really cool. It's not quite what I need right now, but I'm going to file that one.
Yes.
And then what will happen is that sometimes 12 months, 18 months, 2 years later, it's like, Daniel, remember that time that you ran a Halloween competition for a costume for your dog? We'd really like to do that this year.
The timing just happened to be right. You know, yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about your dog, Daniel, because I forgot to mention that in the intro. But you've got a very special friend there, haven't you?
Well, ironically, when I first started Sydney History Tours and Sydney Ghost Tours, one of the planning considerations was that I was helping to look after a Weimaraner dog that suffered very, very badly from separation anxiety. Now, right. William the Weimaraner had been coming to a family where his owner worked from home originally, so she was around him all of the time. But the ability to work from home for this lady vanished, so she had to then go work in an office. The problem was that William the Weimaraner was the world's greatest escape artist. So this dog, there wasn't a gate, a window, a door, a lock that he didn't seem to be able to get past. In fact, we were quite convinced that this dog could teach Houdini how to get out of a safe. Wow. He was that brilliant. But the problem was he would literally run for entire suburbs and then try to get into behind the counter of a butcher in places. Well, I live in a place called Cammeray, which is near North Sydney, and he would go to butchers in places like Cremorne, Gordon, Willoughby, and he would be trying to get behind the counter, at which time this woman would get telephone calls saying, your dog is trying to go and steal sausages from behind my counter. Can you please come and collect him? Now, this happened about 4 or 5 times, and she was now stuck in a situation where she was hauled in by her boss and told, you've got 2 choices here. Either you get the dog situation handled or we're going to have to fire you. Now, at that time, I was about to go and start a exercise program, and there was a pet store in Northbridge shopping centre, and I'm walking past it and I see this photograph where it's William the Weimaraner. It's like, I really need help. We're walking during the day. Can you help? And I'm thinking, well, I'd rather exercise with a point to it rather than actually just getting on a treadmill and basically impersonating a hamster. So I thought, well, okay, I'll give that a go. And then I very quickly worked out that this dog was basically a full-on teenage delinquent. This dog, he literally drank out of toilet bowls. He stole food off tables. He was an absolute bloody terror because he hadn't really received enough training early enough in the piece. Yeah. And the problem was that without drastic intervention of some kind, this dog was going to end up getting the needle. It was going to die. So I thought, well, okay, well, obviously he needs to be around people. So whatever I need to do has to be something that allows me to help him. And when my life started falling apart and I lost a job and all the rest of it, I thought, okay, well, if this is part of the planning considerations, I need to find a way to do this. And part of the process of getting things going was knowing what I didn't know. And I managed to get myself involved in a thing called the New Enterprise Incentive Scheme. Okay. This is basically where essentially you spend something like about 12, 14 weeks in a course doing a certificate in small business. Yeah. And during this time, you actually develop the business plan for your business. Now, something like about 1,700 people applied to get into that particular course. Only like about 20 people actually got into the course.
Wow.
only about 11 people finished the course. 3 people managed to actually get the grant, which was essentially the equivalent of the unemployment benefit for 12 months, provided you could show that you were making an effort to the business.
Yes.
Now, the very process of actually doing the market research, I actually surveyed 3,500 people coming off the end of the Rocks Ghost tours here in Sydney. Mm-hmm. And I actually gave the results of that market survey to the then owners, Brian and Colleen Harrison. Now, as it turned out, there were certain things that they were doing that worked really, really well. And there were things where people were forced to walk around with a noose or a doll or whatever, which turned out a lot of people really hated. Yeah. So as a result, what happened was that I used that information as part of how I designed my initial tours and everything else. And that helped really, really well. It was simply a case of, when I was talking to Brian and Colleen Harrison, they're thinking, well, my God, why do we want to help somebody who's actually going to be a potential competitor? And I would say, look, okay, I'm not setting up in the Rocks. I'm actually setting up a ghost tour somewhere else, telling different stories. Yeah. And you know that the people who come on your tours do other tours. Yeah. So if someone comes on my tour, I'll suggest if they enjoyed my tour, they go and do yours. And that in fact happened for something like about a decade.
Wow.
So in that strange way, it was a case of someone who you would ordinarily think of as being a competitor actually helped me to get started. And funnily enough, there was a gentleman in a place called Junee, which is southwestern New South Wales, called Reg. Now, he owned a house called Monte Cristo. Now, Monte Cristo is known as being the most haunted house in all of Australia.
Wow.
Now, it's been on every Ghostbuster type TV shows you can imagine that's anything to do with Australia. Now, Reg, in the early years of getting started with Sydney History Tours and Sydney Ghost Tours, was someone who I ended up being able to call on the telephone, who acted as like a kind of mentor to me during that period of time getting going. And if I hadn't had the ability to talk to someone outside of what I was doing who wasn't immediately affected by any of it, in the same way, someone who could be impartial about things,
yes. Yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily would have gone through or not, because the ability to actually talk about something that was in my business to someone who would understand allowed me to get the frustration out of the way, which often can paralyze you. If you're angry or pissed off at something, that very being pissed off and having the red mist going over your eyes can blind you to what is often an obvious answer.
Yes.
Yes.
And so you bring up a really good point there, Daniel, about having a mentor, having someone who knows what you're going through, because in some way, they've kind of walked down that path before, and they can give you impartial advice. They can listen to you. You can share your frustrations. They can, give you sort of that level-headed thinking that you really need at that point in time, because you're otherwise blinded, like you said.
When I first started Sydney, particularly Sydney Ghost Tours, and I started being featured in the news, I used to think I was kind of cool and edgy and all the rest of it because I was doing something different. Yeah. I discovered how disgustingly middle-of-the-road normal I really was when all of the mediums, the psychics, the ghost hunters and all the rest of it started coming out of the dark to go and check out the latest ghost thing.
Yes.
And there was one particular guy who was a medium who said something that sort of stuck with me, where he said, well, if someone's as thick as 2 short planks when they're alive, they're probably still going to be as thick as 2 short planks when they're dead.
Yep.
Now, the thing is that the thing that I took away from that was that if you're going to talk to someone about something, make sure it's worthwhile. And the thing is that from the point of view, if you're going to talk to somebody in a mentoring type situation, you want to, A, make sure that they have a clue about what they're doing, and B, ideally have some experience ahead of what you're doing. So you go talk to someone who has done what you want to do because they've been where you want to go.
Yes. Very good.
And the thing is that from that point of view, if they've done the perfect 3-point landings before with knee, and nose, doing the whole face plant a couple of times and thought, okay, well, that's what I need to avoid. And all of a sudden you've got 2 bleeding knees and a bleeding nose at the moment. It's probably
a good idea to hear them out. Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
And so, what would you say to people in terms of, being able to plan things in advance or having some sort of a vision of where you might want to go? Because, people often get stuck in the day-to-day, they're knee-deep in the sand. They haven't got time to lift their head above the trees or anything like that, and really look towards the future. It's a bit uncertain, so they just get stuck in the day-to-day. What would be your advice to someone who's thinking creatively, they're imagining what could be, how important is that process to actually take the time and try and think it out in your head, try and map it out and put some goals in place?
Well, the thing that sort of immediately comes to mind is that a lot of people who go into small businesses are often really not business people per se at all. They are what a bloke called Michael Gerber, who wrote a book called The E-Myth, would describe as being technicians having an entrepreneurial seizure.
Yes.
And what this means is that someone like a mechanic, someone like a hairdresser, someone like a doctor who believes that because they can do the actual physical activity of that particular business, that they can run a business. And the simple truth is that the ability to cut hair, turn a wrench, or be able to write a prescription isn't actually the process of running the business. It's just the physical service delivery part of the business. You've got to have marketing. You've got to understand the legal. You've got to have occupational health and safety. You've got to have branding. There's all of these kinds of things involved. And the thing is that if you're going to create a business that is separate from you, as distinct from owning a job, which a lot of people in the early stages, that's really all it is.
Yes.
Only in this particular case, instead of having one boss, you've got 40 or 50 of them, and they're all like tugging at your nuts like a,
Yep.
Well, yeah, you get the drift.
I get the drift.
So the thing is that from that point of view, it's kind of important that, yes, the service delivery side of things and doing things well is definitely important. But you have to actually go and create the time to be able to step back, understand what are the numbers telling me. And one of the things that happens with a lot of small business people is you don't actually do the numbers. You sit down and do things in a timely fashion and then understand, what are these numbers telling me? A lot of people are word literate, but they're not numerate. They don't read what the numbers are telling them.
Yes.
And then a lot of the time, because they're not doing things in a timely fashion, it's a little bit like finding out where you've been by actually looking on, okay, Google, tell me where I was, rather than actually having a forward plan to where they want to go and say, okay, this is where I was, this is where I wanted to be, what's the difference, and how do I narrow that?
Yes.
That is a very, very different process, and this is a hat as a business owner or an entrepreneur that you have to go and take yourself out of the business and say, okay, how is this thing working as a system that I own, as distinct from being separate from me? And the thing is, a lot of the time, particularly in the early stages, there is a tendency to think of yourself as the business.
Yes.
The problem is, if you get in a habit of doing that, it's going to stay that way forever. And that is actually worse than a prison sentence, because it now means that instead of your safe little cubicle that you might have been working for in an insurance company, where you got to go in at 9 o'clock, leave at 5, put it out of your brain, have exact holidays and all the rest of it, you've now swapped it for a situation that's 4 times more demanding, 10 times more stressful, and you're always worried sick. If I take a holiday, will the business still be there when I get back?
Exactly.
So as a result, you really need to think, you need to plan, what do I want? What's a realistic time frame? What are the resources that I have? What are the resources I don't have? How do I go about getting the resources that I need to get the result that I want within a reasonable time? And the thing is, one of the things that I learned in the time that I spent in the military is that no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. Okay. So when you actually plan it and then try to apply it, it's never going to work exactly the way you thought it would.
Yeah.
But the thing is the very fact that you plan something to start with, at least you've got a clue where you're going.
Yes.
And I can tell you for a fact that probably a large part of the reason that a lot of small businesses fail is that they never really decide where they wanted to go to start with, and they were too proud to get the help that they needed, because business is a team sport.
Yes, very good point.
And if you don't have a good accountant in your background, if you don't have legal advice, if you don't have these kinds of specialties in where people who are good at things that you suck at can actually help you, you set yourself up for failure.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a really, really good point. It's probably one of the main reasons why a lot of small businesses, when they start off, they've really got a limited time span for them to survive. You know, they haven't got all the ingredients there to survive. And until you figure that out, you're really racing against the clock, and the odds are really against you as well. And like you said, even early on in our chat, cash flow right at the very beginning doesn't exist for a lot of small businesses. So everything you do with your investment decisions, with where you spend your money, how you spend your money, all the different decisions you need to make have to be weighed very carefully. And if you're not an expert in any of those sort of things, because you haven't had to do it before, talk to someone who has. You know, talk to a mentor or a coach, or get in a community of like-minded people. There are lots and lots of these groups around, whether it's virtual or in person or whatever. But you don't have to go through this journey alone, because otherwise, Daniel, being in business otherwise is quite a lonely journey if you're doing it all by yourself.
One of the things that I learned as part of the process is that when you start going from working in the classic world that, school trains us to be, where, study hard, get good grades, get a good job, save for your retirement, etc. The thing is, we now live in a time where that entire paradigm has largely gone out the window.
Yeah.
We've got a situation where I have friends who did all of this kind of thing, who embraced a path that I thought I was going to actually be on, where they actually became airline pilots. I've been a lifelong airplane nut, and I do actually have a pilot's license, and I have a number of friends who fly for airlines. Most of these guys are grounded.
Yep.
Most of these guys have literally spent the equivalent of 2.5 times what a doctor would take to become qualified.
Yes.
In terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of getting the qualifications they needed to fly something like a 747 from Sydney to Los Angeles. These guys now, their lives are turned totally upside down.
Yeah.
Because they believed a 19th century, early 20th century paradigm of what life used to be. And the problem is, our schools are still living in that fantasy.
Yeah.
They still produce people to become employees.
Yes.
Now, the thing is that the insidious part of all of it is that when you're young, you accept all of these things as gospel. You don't have the critical ability to look at, say, well, hang on, Bill Gates dropped out of university. Steve Jobs built a business with his best mate in the garage.
That's right.
And they did it for years out of the garage before they had any kind of success. And a lot of the time, people like Bill Gates, for example, he spent years where the entire community told him it was an arsehole for trying to sell software instead of giving it away.
Mm. Yeah. And the thing is, most people don't know the backstory. They look at these people and they think, wow, they were successful. I mean, I know people who today run very successful businesses, and they'll tell you it took me 10 years to become an overnight success,
Yeah.
or something
but
like that.
The point that I'm making here is that when you step out of that particular mindset, you've already taken yourself out of one world and into another with a different set of rules. And the thing is that when people ask me, well, what's the difference? Why would being an entrepreneur being better than working in a job? And my first answer is usually basic arithmetic. And they look at you and go, huh?
Yeah.
But the point is this: when you are an employee, you earn money, you pay tax on it, you try to pay all of your expenses with your after-tax income.
Yes.
Now, when you are in a business situation, you earn money, pay your bills,
yes,
and you pay tax based on what's left.
Yes.
Now, the thing is that if you are creative, learn the rules, and are smart, you've used a lot of that money to provide a tangible benefit for yourself or that business, and it's completely legal.
Mm.
And in fact, the business the government wants you to do this that way. Yeah. Because when you do things, what happens is that you then hire other people who then work for you, that they work, you pay the government, you take the tax out to the government, and then they pay their bills with what's left.
Yeah.
So essentially what you've done is you've turned a group of people basically into dairy cows for the government.
Yep. No, I'm with you. Yeah.
Now, the thing is that this is not to say that working in a job is a bad thing.
No.
But one of the things that I always respected Robert Kiyosaki for is, if you want to learn something, go get a job in the area you want to learn. Yes. That way someone else pays you to learn it.
Yeah, it's paid education, really, isn't it?
It's literally a paid education.
Yeah.
But you look at it from the point of view, I'm keeping my stuff together whilst I'm learning something, so that I can then take what I'm learning to make something else, to make something better.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Well, Daniel, I'm looking at the time. I've got so many more things I want to talk to you about, but I think you've shared a lot of really great stuff. And I think when our listeners go back and maybe listen to this again, they're going to pick out the little nuggets in your stories, which I have. I've been writing a few notes here and there. But typically when we get to this point in the conversation, what I do with a lot of our guests is we play a little game. And hopefully you saw this in some of the notes I sent you, but we want to, I call it rapid response, and it's just trying to pick your brain really quickly on a few things, and just to see how you think on your feet, kind of like shooting from the hip. You happy to do something like that?
I'm thinking if you were a radio announcer, you're probably going to have a finger somewhere around a delete button, so that any blue language that comes through is probably going to not make it to the end recording.
Yeah,
but please go ahead.
Yeah, I've got the finger on the button. Don't worry.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so let's go. Favorite mode of learning for yourself?
Doing.
Ooh, that's good. I actually haven't had that one before. Very good. Now, do you have
the thing is, if you were to look at a chart of what makes people retain the most, it's watching, listening is the lowest level of retention rate. Yeah. If you want someone to be competent at something, usually playing a game or doing a simulation is the best way to get people to do something.
Yeah,
so, for example, if you're wanting to learn about investing or finance or basic accounting, playing something like Robert Kiyosaki's Games Cash Flow is a hell of a lot better way to do it than something like reading a book.
100%. No, it's really good. Have you got a favorite role model or a hero or someone that inspires you?
I've got a lot of different role models. The
You can
person
list
who
more than one.
inspires me,
Yep.
the one that inspired me the most, ironically, is my mother's father, my grandfather. He
Mm-hmm.
was a self-taught carpenter. He
Wow.
didn't even do an apprenticeship. He retired as an equivalent of a millionaire, as someone who owned 8 blocks of flats.
Wow.
And he taught himself along the way all of these skills that allowed him to make it happen. And he was the most generous man I ever knew.
That is incredible. Fantastic. That's lovely. Any quote that you'd like to share with our audience? I know you've got many, but is there any that you've come across that just sort of pops up all the time for yourself?
Here, take my advice. I'm not using it right now.
I love it. Free advice.
No, what the point that I'm making is this: is that probably the best one that I heard was my Sunday school teacher, who said, "Let your walking be your preaching."
Oh,
So don't
really
tell
nice.
people what to do; show them.
Show them. Yes, and that's very much in line with doing, which will help you learn along the way as well. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Fantastic. What about a cause or a charity or something like that you support maybe within the community? I know you're very involved with what you do. Is there anything that stands out for you that you'd like to share?
I actually, when I first started Sydney History Tours and Sydney Ghost Tours, one of the things that I started doing was I tied the percentage of my income to cleaning and restoring gravestones in the cemeteries that I actually went through, as a way of actually saying thank you to the people who did the various things that they did. That's one way of doing it, of course. Yeah. I know a number of people who tithe to specific causes. And the thing is that when the more money that they make, the more money they give away.
Yes. Yes.
So the thing is that I'm not going to tell anybody what's right for them. But if you have something that you believe in, for example, at one stage I got very much involved in trying to save a particular type of tree frog called the green and gold bell frog, not very far away from where my parents lived. Yeah. And I got involved in that. Find something that you really want to make a difference in and do what's right for you. Because the thing is, if you do something like tithing where you give away a percentage of your income and you feel comfortable with that, you can never feel guilty about having more, because the more you get, the more you give.
Yes. Yes. Now, it's a great philosophy. What about something, I was going to say something quirky that maybe you'd like to share with your guests, but I mean, even the fact that you just...
We'd be here for hours.
We'd be here. I know. So we could skip that one, but I know you've done a lot of great things. Like you're a professional dancer as well, I believe.
I used to do competitive ballroom dancing years ago. These days, I just look like one of the hippopotamuses out of Fantasia. I'm not as svelte as I used to be. But my lovely wife, she actually teaches ballroom dancing to wedding couples now. So
there you go. Look at that. That's awesome. Well, Daniel, I mean, I'm always inspired every time I talk to you, because your story, I mean, your whole life is a story, and so is everyone else's. But the way that you always portray it and share it, it's always fascinating. I'm always picking up something from when I talk to you personally. And I know our listeners, when they listen to this, it sounds like one wonderful story, but actually there's a lot of learnings and things that you did even from the early days, and that led you to where you are now. It's, it didn't just happen overnight. It's been a collection of lots of trial and error and learning and making mistakes and then trying to better yourself and all of the things we talked about. So where do you see your journey taking you from this point onwards? I mean, if we were to kind of follow you, what have you got on the horizon? Maybe we can keep our ear to the ground and look out for.
At the moment, I am looking very, very closely at the current situation and looking back at patterns of what has happened during economic downturns before. And one of the things that's really quite frightening me right now is the fact that our current situation if the closest historic parallel is 1929, the great crash that caused the Great Depression. And the difference here is that unlike the Great Depression, much, much larger amounts of money have been lost or moved, and the entire world has been going into depression much, much faster than what happened during 1929. In 1929, there started being a crash, and then things went down consistently for a couple of years, but they didn't happen all over the world and not all at the same time.
Yeah.
And the thing is that I don't believe that the economy is going to bounce back fast in the same way that a lot of people are just going, well, mate, she'll be right. I think that we have to face reality that things are not going to be rosy for a lot of people for a long time. And I'm absolutely, one of the things that really sort of worries me is that I think we're living in an element of a bit of a fool's paradise right now, where a lot of people are getting stimulus checks and just assuming that, okay, it'll blow over and everything's just going to go back to normal. I think that we need to accept that the government isn't going to save us. I think we need to accept that you need to be taking charge of your own destiny. And I think that part of that has got to be becoming financially literate. It's got to be being in charge of your own money supply and being as self-reliant as possible. Now, now, it could be, I would like to be wrong. I would really love to be wrong. But what I really believe is that it's a bit like, if you can have your own food, have your own money supply and all the rest of it, and not need it, that's great. But it's a little bit like having insurance. Having it and not needing it is great, but it's a whole lot better than needing it and not having it.
Yes.
And we saw earlier this year with that ludicrous situation with toilet paper, how people can go into total panic and then things really can get stuffed up really quickly.
Yeah.
I think that the stronger and more self-reliant you can be, the better that you're going to weather the next few years. And I think that a lot of the skills that are attached to being self-reliant, things like being able to cook, being able to clean, being able to mend clothing, all of these are things that they're not rocket science, but I think that these are basic things that a lot of people have lost.
Yes.
I know people that don't ever cook. They say, okay, well, I'm either going to go and get Uber Eats or grab something from a cafe. Well, what happens when you can't do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just thinking at the moment that whilst I would like to believe that things are going to come good, I think it makes sense to be prepared for things staying, well, kind of shit for a while. And the thing is, if it gets better, well, great. But if it doesn't, put yourself in a position where you're going to be okay, or a lot better than okay by preference.
No, that's a really good piece of advice. So what a great time to be in, even though you might not look at it this way in the present, but right now we've got the time to get our affairs in order, pick up some new skills, get a bit proactive, get healthy, set a vision, set your sights for the future, take a bit more control back into your life, not be as dependent as, we're being told we have to be, really try and gain some of that independence back. And if you were ever going to try anything, now's a great time to try it, because
well, most of the major multi-billion-dollar businesses from the 20th century were born in the Great Depression.
Yes.
So what I would suggest is that to look at the current situation not as a disaster, but as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that even when things suck, there are going to be specific things, specific areas that go really well. So, for example, if you're an airline pilot you're going to be in trouble. But if you're a charter pilot, at the moment, they're actually doing more business as charter pilots. They're doing 70% more business than they ever did because all the airlines are shut.
Yep.
And if you, for example, were selling lottery tickets right now, you're going to be doing pretty well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So where there's a downside, there's always an upside. And I guess, following night, there's always day. So at the end of the day, there's a lot you can take, a lot of positive things you can take out of this current situation. There are people that are doing some very, very clever, entrepreneurial spirited things out there for themselves, for the environment, for their community. I mean, you just have to almost step back and go, okay, well, maybe this current thing I've been doing for the last little while is not panning out. What else could I do? So it's asking better questions of yourself.
One of the things that came up in a movie that was done about, I think, 2008, 2009, that was talking about the 2008 crisis. It was a movie called Margin Call. Mm-hmm. One of the characters in it said something along the lines of, money is never lost, it just moves.
Yes, 100%.
So if there's anything that I would suggest to people right now is say, every day you'll turn on the news and say, we're losing this amount of money or the rest of it. Say, okay, they didn't lose it. It just went from one place to another.
Yep.
Where is it going? And where can I stand right next to it to catch some?
Yeah, that's it. Well, one of my good mentors, Dr. John D. Martini, actually said money flows like a river. It'll find its way through the cracks and through the mountains and the valleys, and it'll flow wherever a path opens up. And so therefore, you just got to either find the path or create the path for that to flow towards you. But if you're standing somewhere where there's absolutely no water, you can't expect it to get to you and pray for it. You've got to find a way to get to it or direct a channel so that it can flow its way through to you. So I think that's really good advice, Daniel. Mate, how can people find out more about your business or get in touch with you if they wanted to learn about your history tours or your ghost tours or just in general want to reach out to you? Where would you recommend they go to?
Well, easiest way. It sounds a little bit egotistical, but when someone says, just Google me, you kind of feel like oh my God, this guy's doing a total tosser. But the thing is that if you were to type in Daniel Phillips Sydney Ghost Tours or Daniel Phillips Sydney History Tours, I'm probably going to be the top search result. So
fantastic.
That would be the easiest way to go.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for spending a good amount of time with us today and sharing your personal story, your endeavors, the tough times, all you went through and all the creative period you went through, setting up your business, and obviously you're still on the journey, and it's fascinating, and you're doing almost a community service in a way to tell the stories of people who are no longer here to tell them. So everything you do is fascinating, and people who are listening to this, I hope you took out some really, really good points from a business perspective as well. And Daniel, I had a great time talking to you today. Hope you did too.
Always fun, mate. Take care.
All right. Thank you. If you like this podcast and would like to understand a little bit more about what was just discussed, then you're in luck. Simply head over to breakfreefromcorporate.com and we have a fantastic bonus gift waiting for you to download. All we ask in return is that you leave us a review on iTunes and or Stitcher, whichever you use. And lastly, help us share this podcast around with your friends, your colleagues through Facebook, Twitter, Google+, or LinkedIn. We truly appreciate all your support and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode of Break Free from Corporate. Once again, to access previous and all future episodes, visit breakfreefromcorporate.com and subscribe today.